Ha, ha. Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello minions, welcome back to Professor Awesome and the Minions of Doom. As of today, ProfAwesome.com is still not up. I've got some, I've got the basic new design ready to go, but it's not actually implemented yet. So that's why you're not seeing that yet. Another news, people have been asking about Harry the dog. He's not enjoying the cold weather. It's every day is touch and go when you have an elderly dog. I suppose I finished writing a fictional book, which I'm going to mention here later on. I suppose that's why it's on my mind. A few months ago, and I've been editing it. I have another editing project I have to get out of the way before I can work on that some more. And I've had a couple of people ask about that and the progress on that. I haven't worked on it since writing the initial draft. Possibly I'll work on it next week over break because I can't do academic editing. I won't have enough resources where I'm going to be to do the academic editing, and I can possibly do fiction editing, but it's going to depend on what's happening as I take a little break next week to go visit family in Michigan and Indiana area, which actually leads to the next announcement, which is to say, although it's March, I'm already starting to make plans for speaking engagements in the summer. I'm actually likely to meet with someone. We're working out some of the details, but I'm meeting with someone to talk about one reading group that book group that I talk to in Michigan every summer. And so if you live in the southwest Michigan area, northern Indiana area, maybe I can get as far as Chicago. I guess I can get further if you pay for me to come. And you'd like me to come speak to your local library, your summer reading group, that kind of thing. I always love doing those. They're very different from teaching, a class or giving some sort of other kind of public lecture. It's nice to have a group of people who aren't experts but are really passionate about what they do, which has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. So today I want to talk about world building, fantasy world building, and this particular topic was brought up by a fellow by the name of Ralph the Fanboy, and Ralph the Fanboy posted this to the medieval history subreddit, and he and I have emailed or messaged back and forth about what he's doing, a few times. And so I'm just going to introduce the topic. I'm just going to read what he wrote. I've had a story in the back of my mind for a while now, and I just had some free time to work on some of it. After finishing my first draft, I hit a bit of a snag. The world didn't have aesthetic I was going for when I read it. It's basically an amalgamation of the King Arthur mythos and the Norman invasion England, set in the 8th to 9th centuries, Common Era Europe, with dragons, elves, dwarves, and every other fantasy race/creatures. I've also made a very crude map based on the time period, kingdom territories and stuff. I know the basics of the time period, like full plate Gothic armor hasn't yet been invented, but the tiny details like what people wore, tunics, right? Social and political structures. Is feudalism the same in every century? And means of production of goods. Were there already guilds and journeymen? My utter lack of knowledge in that period of history is what made the story feel so empty. That in my writing skill needs a lot more polishing. Can anyone help me out? And so I contacted Ralph the Fanboy and talked to him a little about his situation, and with his permission, thought I would share a response here rather than respond to the message board. And the reason I want to do that is because this is a really frequent question that I get aimed at me. I've edited fantasy, science fiction, steampunk, fiction novels before. Of course, medieval literature is, of course, my own field. So I would say probably once a month, I have someone who wants me to read who's not submitting it for publication. They just want someone to read their fantasy novel. And I almost always say no for a variety of reasons. Some of them legal, but mostly, frankly, time. I have a lot of reading I have to do professionally, and it just, as much as I like you, if I'm not involved in any way in the actual production of a novel, I can't just sit down and read. Someone handed me one and said, it's only at 300 some odd pages. It should only take a day and a half or so. And I thought, I don't have a day and a half to devote to this project. Of course, Ralph the Fanboy didn't do that. But I'd say that then on top of that, I get maybe once every 3 months or so, not someone bringing me their novel, asking me to look at it, but they're bringing me their notes for their world building. And people tend to bring fantasy world building notes to me. I've gotten people bringing other sorts of world building notes, but usually they go, I want to do some medieval something medieval, so I'm going to take this to a medievalist. And not surprisingly, Ralph the Fanboy here initially posted his question to the medieval history subreddit. And so, once again, this is where he was going for. And so I just want to talk a little bit about generally world building when you're writing your own story. And although I'm thinking really about fantasy world building, I suppose this works fine for any kind of world building. So the problem really for world building is when people come and they talk to me, they generally have they generally have fallen into one of the two major pitfalls, and some people fantastically manage to fall into both. The first one, about which you can find a lot of people writing about online, is the Planet of the Hats trope. This is a common trope that's associated with television, but you find it in fantasy or science fiction literature a lot. And that is, consider any science. The metaphor is that in science fiction movies or TV shows where they go to another planet and it's mainly marked off by the people all wear the same kind of weird hat, or they all wear the same kind of uniform, or they're all marked by having a culture with one particular weird element to it. And that really defines them beyond everything else. There's no complexity to them beyond that. And so, and literally this can come down to naming conventions, as in Planet of the Apes. The important element of it is it has apes, and the apes run the show. That's the important part of it. The other side, so that's one major pitfall, is that everything in your world is super duper stereotyped. If you're going to have a dwarf, they must be a miner. They can't be a dwarven farmer. They can't be, they must be that. If you're going to have, an elf, they must be a Tolkien-esque tall and willowy elf. They have to live in trees. They can't live underground. They can't, etc. They can't live in houses. So that's a common problem. And so usually I think first-time writers have a tendency just to flat out steal the aesthetics of other works that they've read, which is okay. But because of that, they have a diminished view of those, and they become so simplistic as to be unrealistic. So that's one side. The other side, and this is most common for the world building folks, is Tolkien derangement syndrome. And what do I mean when I say Tolkien derangement syndrome? Well, Tolkien built an unbelievably complex world. And so I've had students literally take linguistics classes with me because they want to flesh out their fantasy world. The languages. They feel like they have to invent a language for each of their races, a full-on language for each of the races. They feel like they have to do a great variety of things. And there's nothing, wrong. There's nothing, again, inherently wrong with thinking, oh, I want to develop this. The problem is, for most people, it is not practical, and I would argue not even desirable to try to do what Tolkien did, because frankly, you simply don't have the time. So let's take Ralph the Fanboy for an example. His opening line here is, I've had a story in the back of my mind for a while now, and I just had some free time to work on some of it. And that's a great way, if you want to write, that's a great way to write, a really pleasant and enjoyable way that eventually could lead to something that you're really proud of and a really good work of art. But you're not going to get Tolkien that way. So to give you a sense, let me just lay out a little timeline for you of Tolkien. So after the war and everything and going to school, he takes on his first job as a reader at Leeds in 1920. Okay. And then in 1925, he becomes the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. So that's 1925 that he takes that job. So we don't have all the details, but it appears that in 1937 is when he started writing The Lord of the Rings. Well, to give you a sense of time then, this is a guy who had, by the time he even starts Lord of the Rings, doing some quick math here, he had started his academic career 17 years earlier. In that time, he had also written really the most important essay, a series of lectures turned into an essay about Beowulf. So this is a guy who's hardcore into the medieval world. It takes 17 years to do that. So in 1930, between the beginning of his academic life and this, well then what about 1937 so 1937 is when he started writing it. Well, when does it first appear in print? Well, 1954. There's another 17 years there. So really, if we're looking at this, what we discover is he spent decades crafting this. First, he spent almost 2 decades, just his entire professional life working in this world. And then almost 2 decades, writing it and rewriting it before it eventually appears in print. So just to put it in its boldest terms, let's start the clock in 1920 when he takes his first position at Leeds, and stop the clock in 1954 when Lord of the Rings first appears in print. That's 34 years. Now you can argue about other things that were done in the middle, which is fine. But the point I just want to make is we are literally talking over 3 decades between the beginning of professionally thinking about this and the end. And so these efforts I need to do what Tolkien did, listen, you will not be able to do what Tolkien did simply because, number one, you're not an expert in it who gets to research it all the time. Even if you think I'm going to make myself an expert in it, fine. But unless you're a medieval scholar like me, you just don't have the time to do that. I am not an expert in, no matter what degree of expertise I can get in a thing that I don't spend all my time working in, I'm never going to have the level of expertise of someone who's spent day in, day out working with this subject matter. So So don't try to out-Tolkien Tolkien. You need a day job and you need to make your money. And unless you happen to have the nicest job in medieval literature and then take decades to really think about it, rather than doing something in your free time that you want to do for enjoyment, you're not going to be able to do Tolkien, and you don't have to be Tolkien. There's no need for you to be Tolkien. It would be great for your reader to pick up your book and go, oh my gosh, this person is the new Tolkien. But when I pick up a book, I'm not thinking, oh my gosh, I hope this person's the new Tolkien. I think, I really hope this is a good story that I'll enjoy. In the end, what you really want to do is write a good story that you will enjoy writing and that people will enjoy reading. So these are the twin pitfalls that are hard to sort of go between without falling off the cliff into either one. So how do you do this? How do you get between those two without hurting your world building? And to this end, I want to use what I call the Jurassic Park principle. No, not the world building of the book but instead what they do within the book. And Jurassic Park, one of the main ideas of why everything goes wrong is that it's not possible to extract 100% of a dinosaur's DNA. So they have to fill in the DNA with, as I recall, frog DNA. And this is, I think, a good way to go about crafting a world for your story. You don't have to build an entire world. You can leave gaps, but then you fill in the gaps with things that you know about. So, first of all, you want to shoot for things that are local, and that's going to be an important principle. Use the local all the time. What do I mean by local? Well, local can mean, literally nearby where you live, but it can also mean local in time. So let me give you an example of this. The book that I am not currently editing, the one that people are asking me when is it going to be available, and I keep shrugging. I don't even have a working title for it yet. That book, it takes place essentially in our world, in our time. So when my characters need to travel around and interact with the world, when I see a house in the world, I don't think, what do houses generally look like? I pick a house. I pick a house that I know, that I've seen, describe what it looks like from the outside, the geography that they move around in. I don't have a map. That's a sort of weird thing which we feel like fantasy novels have to have. Unlike other genres, I don't provide a map of the world because it's our world, and I don't provide a map of the city. And so, do the time frames make sense for how long it would take to drive here, how long it would take to walk here? In it, yeah, I do. They do. I'm confident they do. Why? Because I literally placed them mentally in the map of the town I live in my mind. So the distance between, say, the courthouse and the elementary school in the book I've just written is pretty much the distance between the courthouse and the elementary school in the town I live in. And so I know I'll maintain consistency. And if ever I need a little detail to be thrown in there, I just take the detail from the thing in our world. Well, yeah, that's fine, you're saying to yourself, but, I'm not writing about our world. I'm writing about this fantasy world with dragons and unicorns and things. Well, that's fine, but you can still find local analogs for them. So, for example, Ralph the fanboy here asked a question about tunics, and he wants to know the tiny details. Well, you can have your characters primarily wearing tunics, but then what do those tunics look like? How varied are they? Well, I would say the simple answer to that is find the local analog. And maybe our local analog to tunics might be t-shirts. And when you're describing what people wear, you think about them as if they're wearing a long t-shirt, and describe it as you might describe that, and vary it the way that you would vary those things. Any accessories, think about what would be the equivalent accessory to that, and use that instead. There's no reason for you to come up with every detail, or to know every detail in this case, the authentic medieval world, nor to develop faux details for things that you're never going to do. If you're Tolkien, and you've got decades to do that, you can do that. But even Tolkien is in many ways using, I would argue, the Jurassic Park principle. He doesn't maybe know he's doing it, but he's taking everything from the Germanic mythologies that he studied his whole life. And so almost every assumption he has about them, the unspoken ones, come out of those. Some maybe a little bit out of medieval romance, but mostly out of that. Yeah, so use what you know to fill in the blanks. You don't have to understand everything about the history of the world. You don't have to know every single detail. And in that way, you can have a little bit more well-rounded world. This prevents you from falling into the planet of the hats. So another example would be, whenever I have a character, I always give that character a voice in my head, and the voice I give them is literally the voice of someone I know. And they're not named after that person. Sometimes they don't look like that person. But by giving them the voice of someone I know, giving them those vocal tics, the ways that they would say phrases other than the ways that other people would say them, it prevents every character from sounding like me. And in the same way, you can prevent every character from being a Planet of the Hats trope, just by adding the little details that are true about that character or true about that place. So if you have a band of adventurers, why not base everyone who is on a person who's in your community softball team? Rather than characters who you have sort of seen in movies or read in other books. Take them from real people. And then, by the very fact that real people have these little tics and little details about them that don't make them fall neatly into a stereotype, your characters also will have these same tics and things that will prevent them from falling into a stereotype. Now, is this to say you should never do any kind of research? I would say no, you definitely should do research. So if you're interested in the fantasy world, by all means, delve into medieval history. Delve into the anthropology, the archaeology, the literature, all that fun stuff. There's all sorts. Obviously, I'm very interested in it. So, when someone comes to me with their, hey, I'm building a world, I don't really have time to deal with this, is really fighting against my other impulse, which is say, yes, let me geek out about this with you. So when I see Ralph the fanboy, my view is that you don't try to be Tolkien isn't a dismissive, you suck, you shouldn't try to be Tolkien, but rather, yeah, I get why you love this. I do. And I'm telling you not to try to be Tolkien because it can be counterproductive for you doing what I would love you to do, which is write a really awesome story. So you should do research until, frankly, you just get tired of it. And when you're tired of it, don't do any more research and just fill in the blanks. Because if you're sick of details, your reader probably is already sick of details. We like our worlds to be consistent, aesthetically consistent in some way, but readers are typically not coming at a text in an uncharitable way. They're typically wanting to be entertained. Reading takes work. And, if you're someone who reads a lot, it might not feel like there's any work involved, but it is. And a good book makes the work barely worth anything. It's like the work of walking around a theme park. Yeah, when you think about walking around a theme park, how much walking you've done that day, it would be like it's an unbelievable hike, but you don't care because you're not even thinking about that because you're enjoying the fun of being at the theme park or anything like that. So just research until you don't want to research anymore. Assume that your reader cares less about that research than you do, so not everything you learn should end up on the page. And then, finally, don't let the history overwhelm your story. Your story is what's important. Your readers, if they wanted to know about medieval history, well, they wouldn't pick up your book. They'd pick up a book of medieval history. They wouldn't pick up a book of medieval fantasy. So let your story rule over this thing. Now, what if you're sitting here thinking, oh man, I kind of wanted to be Tolkien? Okay, but Tolkien wasn't Tolkien in one night. He didn't sit down and his first book wasn't Tolkien. I guess by definition it was, but you understand what I mean, the full-fledged guy who we think of. And he wrote some things which were, not as good as some other things. This is just the nature of writing. And you get better over time. And you understand the world better over time. So if you really, really want to be Tolkien, then just keep writing medieval fantasy. Don't stop. Keep writing even when the stories aren't good. And when they're not good, instead of saying, this sucks and I'm no good, think, okay, how do I make my next story better? And keep writing better and better stories. And what's going to happen is over time, the worlds that you build are going to become richer and richer and richer. So before we go, I want to tell you one other tip for world building, which is a kind of nerd tip, which won't be applicable to everyone. But if you're like me and you're an uber nerd and you like to play tabletop role-playing games, another trick that I do is I steal characters from the tabletop role-playing games I've played, characters that have been played by my friends, and will use those characters in some, modified form in my stories. Not the characters who they played for, a couple weeks or in a one-off, but I mean the kind of characters who developed over, a couple years of play. Those characters just can't help but becoming really well developed. And the reason I'm ending with that tip is not just because it's an uber nerd tip, but also because what I've just talked about is just keep writing stories and write story after story after story. Eventually, your flattest characters over time are going to develop in your mind into something else. And they're going to be like those characters, and they're going to take on a life of their own. So when you're writing your fantasy novel, you're not trying to make a living of it. You're trying to have fun with it, in most cases. So have fun with it. Enjoy the research as long as it's enjoyable. And then when it's no longer enjoyable, just ignore the history and get on with the fantasy. Well, that's all for today, minions.